So my first question, I suppose, just to kind of give you the tricky one first, is really, since I started with it, what actually gives you the right to criticise? And it's over to you, Tiff.
I don't think I particularly do. I think what gives the critic the right are three things. One is expertise. So whatever art form they are criticising, they need to have some in-depth knowledge of, and maybe other art forms as well. So it wouldn't just be literature, but there needs to be an element of specialism. There needs to be an openness to something that's new, so they can see. They both have a sort of knowledge of tradition and an openness to something that's innovative. And then the third thing that I think is the kind of social duty of the critic is the need to be speaking to a public, a kind of ideal of a public, but criticism and the role of the critic is a public act. And I think where we are at the moment with the decline of criticism is instead a kind of fragmentary, privatized nature of judgment. So people are still making judgments, but they're no longer talking about them so much in public. Obviously critics exist and there's still a certain amount of criticism, but I think that public role of criticism is what's on the decline. And I think without it, I would go so far as to say you can't really create two things. One, a common culture where you talk in public about what is good, what is bad, what is interesting. That's a sort of silent discussion. And I also think that has an impact upon the arts, because how do we know if something's worth our attention if there isn't a kind of critical engagement with it? And I think that's where we are now. Things might pop up and we won't necessarily know that they exist.
So, just where do you fit it?
Where do I fit
Where do you fit into that conversation? Leading the public into knowing what conversations need to be had, as you just pointed out.
Me personally?
Or yeah, you as a critic.
I don't think I'm not. I have criticised.
I think you are.
I do. I think I'm an amateur critic. I'm an amateur critic, so I have reviewed for things like, there used to be this Radio 4 programme, Saturday Review, where you'd go and be sent to things.
Is that all? Just Radio 4? Okay.
But it's a decline, it just shows you how bad it's got, right? In all seriousness, so I think you have to know your stuff. I think you do have to have something to draw on. You know, if you're reading Tolstoy, Middlemarch, Rooney, Sally, if you're engaging with the literature, you have to have read it. And you have to read outside your comfort zone and all the rest of it. But I think you just have to be sensitive to something that hasn't been said before, and you have to be able to explain it. So your criticism has to be understandable, not in a dumbed down way, but it's for an audience. And so you have to be speaking to a public, an idea of your, I think Virginia Woolf talked about the general reader, and that's your kind of, it's an idealized person in your head, really, but that's who you're talking to. Somebody who doesn't necessarily, might not even go to what you're going to, but you are an advocate for it in a way that isn't just about praising it. It's not an act of affirmation. It's not trying to necessarily tear it down. It's something that's actually worth your attention and inexhaustible, really, that you and a number of other people can engage with it and draw some insight out. That means when you go back to it, you see it afresh.
All right, very good, very good. Ivan.
Okay, well, Tiffany said it so well. What can I add? Something that makes it a bit obvious, you have to really love the art form. I mean, really love it, to the extent that you want to spend your working days always engaging with it. It sounds like an obvious remark, but not everybody would agree with this. I once had a Twitter pile-on because I made some, mildly critical remark about a composer that a lot of Twitter followers thought I should have a protective cordon put around them. So I was piled on, and somebody did a little bit of research on me and announced to the world on Twitter that I was a failed composer. Now, there's some truth in that. In the sense that I tried it and gave up because I realized I wasn't talented enough. And it was a very important experience because it taught me the value and the intrinsic value of musical material, the actual stuff out of which music is made. It taught me what the stakes are. It's really bloody hard to write music, and I learned that from failing to do it myself. And it gave me of course, far from making me, turning me into an embittered creature, determined to pull everybody down because I'd failed, which was the thesis of these charming people who piled onto me on Twitter. It actually increased my love for the art form, you know, because I know what it is from the inside, and that was an invaluable experience. What else gives me the right to? I've practiced at it. I think when I started, a little over 20 years ago, I didn't write my first broadsheet review till I was 45, in fact. I'd done a lot of other things before I turned to it. And I suspect, although I've never gone back to reread them, that my first efforts were not especially good. I think they're sort of decent now. Sometimes I can even look at a piece of mine and think, oh, that's okay, you know. Other times I look at it and think, yeah, I missed it. You know, I didn't hit the nail on the head. So I've practiced the art. I think that's another thing. And just to add to something about what Tiffany said about being an advocate. I mean, this is perhaps a subject where we may possibly differ, because it's said that we critics should be advocates for the art form, and I think that's certainly true. But at the same time, I think it's important that we don't, as it were, go native. In other words, that we end up sharing, in the end, rather uncritically. This thing is humming, isn't it? It's rather horrible. That we end up sharing uncritically in the values and assumptions of the, in my case, classical music world that I move in. I think that in itself there's a danger there, and I think a critic has to keep one foot, as it were, in the world of the general reader. You have to be able to sympathize with the instinctive reactions, let's call them prejudices if you like, of that common reader that Tiffany mentioned, because maybe they're not entirely unreasoned, and unless you hold out a hand, as it were, to that common reader who may not, you know, share your enthusiasm for experimental music of the 1940s and may find it total junk, and unless you can empathize with that view and not dismiss it scornfully as the remark of an ignoramus, but instead, to a degree, empathize with it and help to bring that person round, then you're probably not doing the job well. You become just a kind of cheerleader for the art form, which is, again, is part of the role, but it's not. You have to guard against being totally an insider.
Okay.
I think
It's a world of provisos.
indeed it is.
Thank you. JJ.
Thanks, Austin. I guess there's. I take those points and agree with them, but I think the point that we have to admit is that the public is the problem, not people, but the notion of a public which has any kind of common or commensurate identity. I think the point about that is that for me, the crisis, and I've been reading about the crisis of criticism ever since I've been in the art world. I am a failed artist, by the way. And I went to art school, which is, of course, kind of where a lot of art critics come from, because you've got to do something that engages you with the reality of making art before you can really not, be knowledgeable about it, but be in love with it, right? To be enthusiastic about it. Adrian Searle, who writes for The Guardian, was a painter at Winchester College, and he failed to be a successful painter, but he knew how to talk about it, and in a way which was interesting and passionate and exciting and so on. But I think that the point about the public is really the issue, because ever since critics have discussed the crisis of criticism, and it's not a new debate by any stretch of the imagination, it's at least 50 years old. The problem is that really that crisis is one of shared critical terms. And it's a particular problem when we have a culture where there's a growing authoritarianism and conformism about what must be said, as opposed to what can be said. So, for me, a critic is someone who asks, "Do we like this?" Right? That's an important point. To be on the side of the audience and on the side of the art and the artwork is something to do with saying that there might be a meeting place. It's not for sure, it's not guaranteed, but in some way we might be able to say, well, what do we think this is good? I mean, liking is a fairly kind of trivial thing, but even then. That's a hard thing to get everybody to agree on, right? And then, of course, you know, the critic can ask, well, who do we mean by we? Okay. Now, the problem, though, today is the critics are now checking, all they ever do now is to check whether what they say about the work and how the work is understood, the artwork, whether it complies with authorized criteria. Right? That's the real problem right now. I mean, there have been other crises of criticism in the past. There's, you know, and I've written and studied the initial one in the art world in the 70s because that's when it happened. But fundamental to this particular crisis is the outsourcing of critical authority to, you know, what I would cleverly describe as meta-discourses, right? But actually, they're really master narratives, and you know, we thought that master narratives were got rid of with postmodernism, but actually they're back with a vengeance. They just happen to be things like ecologism, decolonization, gender theory, some of those, you know, so the most present master narratives, right, about how one should evaluate the work. And these have little interest in the specifics of a particular discipline or genre, or even are interested in the particularities of any given artwork, an artwork which you might yourself have very different takes on because of who you are, right? So the point of, yeah, so that's kind of for me the real issue. You know, we have a situation in which the critic is left to have to mount a critique of the takeover of the institution of judging by these discourses. They're not interested in art of any, you know, they're interested in wondering whether the thing that we're all talking about complies to certain criteria. Even as trivial as whether, you know, the suit that I'm wearing, it might be critiqued by a fashion critic, but actually it doesn't matter what it looks like. It depends whether it's been made by sweatshop labor or whether the cotton has been environmentally sourced. These things have nothing to do with the work. They have to do with orthodoxies and moralities which are now increasingly dominant and orthodox. So that's, for me, the main issue that we have right now.
But technique of production is part and parcel of a critique of a work of art, isn't it? So some of those things may factor into your critique. Oh, I'm speaking loudly. Can you not hear me talk? I'll take the one that works. Okay, I'll try that again. So I am saying that there may be other factors, like those social factors, those political factors, that may actually fit into the critique of the work, you know, legitimately. So I think it'd be interesting to kind of get that viewpoint. I also think, well, it's two things. One is that old maxim, those who can do, those who can't teach, those who can't teach become critics. But I think that there's something to be said for the idea that there's a criticism and there's critique. And I'm assuming you kind of engage, maybe, unless I'm making a false dichotomy, but the idea of a critique as being some kind of positive, constructive intervention in the conversation rather than just saying it's shit, which is what I would call a criticism. So I mean, again, how do you nuance that conversation? And the second thing is that, JJ, I thought you were saying that you were kind of the unelected voice of the public. You're representing what the public might appreciate, but you weren't. And Ivan, you were very clearly saying that you maybe shouldn't necessarily engage or indulge the public in that instrumental way. So again, I have misrepresented you, so I apologize, but you can still maybe want to kick around some of these ideas. And the final thing which is on the table, which JJ introduces, is that this idea of instrumental critique, which is kind of what you finished with, which is looking at a work of art, or going to a museum, as Tiff will know, and kind of being guided by curatorial notes to understand a work of art in a way that maybe you never thought you had to understand it, being given some kind of historical analysis of its moment and its racism and its environmental impact, and whether you should engage with that because that's part of the public discourse, or whether you have to rise above it in some respects and then have an abstract conversation which maybe very few people relate to. Anyway, lots of questions, no answers. I'll go.
On a critic is somebody who can't paint. My example of that is the critic James Wood, who tends to mainly criticise literature. He's a literary critic. New Yorker, New Republic, and all the rest of it. I find him an absolutely brilliant critic. Whether it's Tolstoy or non-fiction, he's somebody that I turn to guide me through. And it is a kind of guide, but it's the one that you're having a conversation with through literature. He recently tried a few years ago to write a book, and it's fine. It's fine. I mean, if you wrote it, it's an achievement, but it's nothing that you'd ever go back to. And so it just so happens there is an art, I think, of criticism, which is really grounded in his understanding of literature, his passion for it, and his ability to show you in a way that opens it up for you. JJ made the point that we've been talking about the decline of criticism for some time. And I wonder if it's worth just sort of trying to look at it in a sort of periodized way, because I think where we are today is a result of discussions that did start really in the 70s and have not been resolved. So you really had this sort of, I think...
Can you whiz through
Okay, so really a crisis of cultural value, really a crisis that there is such a thing there. That isn't just a social positioning, that isn't just sweatshop labour, that it has a standalone quality that you should get into, basically, that kind of advocacy standalone. I think that was a crisis in the 70s, and it's been playing out ever since. So it's taken a form of a crisis of elitism, attempts to democratise, to instrumentalise, and now it's woke. And woke finally gives the institutions that are underconfident with what they've got in their collections a purpose, which is criticising and destroying their collections. My one note of optimism is I don't think that's what the audience want. I think they want more. I think they want the artwork and they want the criticism. They're not getting it.
Okay, thanks.
Just like to remind you of this. You know, what does it say at the top? You know, it says living freedom. And a fine artwork of whatever kind is an example of living freedom. That's what it is. It's a little, it creates around itself a kind of vibration. You know, it's a space, first of all, it's a unique object. It's as unique as a human individual. It's not to be treated merely as one example of a type, which is the way so much ideologically motivated criticism of the kind that JJ was inveighing against seeks to do. It wants to see artworks merely as an example of a type of thing. Here's an example of a colonialist thing. Here's an example of an anti-women artwork. Here's an example of artwork that grinds the face of the poor, or whatever. You know, it's yoked to an easily named cause, and in that naming, it loses its existence as an example of living freedom. With a real work of art is able to entertain multiple viewpoints, and it becomes the site, in a way, of a kind of conversation almost, you know, and it's our job to in a sense, to launch the conversation off, to open the space around it. Am I allowed to can I tell a story?
Oh, God. How long is this going to last?
Not very long. Well, it's a good story.
Well,
it's my only story. So I like to tell it, you know, my only story about critics. But it does illustrate, in a way, the dangers of trying to pigeonhole something and the dangers of elevating spontaneity into the be-all and end-all of criticism. One of the criticisms made of critics is that they're not spontaneous. You know, they think too much. They're chin-strokey, I think is the phrase, and that therefore there's something basically illegitimate and not quite right about their responses because they're too pondered over. Now, there's a nice story which shows how wrong that is, and it's about a great South African critic who earned his living in this country. He went along to the premiere of one of Benjamin Britten's great song cycles, The Nocturne, I think it was 1968. And he wanted to write the review immediately afterwards, partly because he was in a bit of a state about it. And the reason he was in a state, as he explained to the sub-editors at The Observer when he arrived there, you know, he said, I don't know what to think about this piece, you know, that I've just heard. He said, is it really any good? I mean, Britain, can he even set English? You know, he was really very doubtful about it. And so he went off into a little room, brow furrowed, you know, to have a think about this review. And there was dead silence for about 20 minutes. And then the subs heard the sound of banging on a typewriter, furious banging on a typewriter. And then after about half an hour, he emerged, you know, the door was flung open, and there was Andrew Porter, and he's all wreathed in smiles and all radiant. And he waved his piece of paper over it and said, it's an absolute masterpiece. And so his spontaneous reaction was, oh, I don't know what I think about this. His constructed reaction was, it's an absolute masterpiece, you see. So, and this is what criticism often, you have to construct a response. And you do that by engaging with the work in all its richness and from different angles. You engage with your own doubt even, you see. And so it's a complex, rich thing, and which is why I share JJ's worries about art now being confined and losing its freedom.
Yeah, well, just to add to that, there is a concept, if you can hear me, in architecture now, which is about design thinking, which is the idea that you can think through designing. Whereas I was always taught you had to think first and then design, but people are privileging the act rather than the thought process, and that's a bit of a problem for. Yeah, just take a look at the architecture around us. Anyway, JJ.
Quickly, Austin, you said I was on the side of the public. I'm not, and it's not quite right. What I'm on the side of is being free to form publics around things that we're not sure are good or bad, right? That's the big issue for me. It's like I've been called a dinosaur, right, on Twitter. Feel sad. But the point is, like, of course, at every given moment, your authority is contingent. It's contingent on knowing what's going on, having some sense of the history. Of course, nowadays nobody cares about the history of even contemporary art, right? So it's very kind of instantaneous. But the point about the public is not some monolith, but it's also not some fossilized set of identities. So the key thing is, like, well, can we come together, not necessarily as people, right, as individual social people who have all that kind of differences, but can we come together around this kind of peculiar thing which is an artwork, right? There's a good, the greatest film recently on art criticism is Tar, right? And Lydia Tarr does, of course, it's a very polemical film because it sets out all the kind of contradictions in the conservatoire, in the art, in the idea of specialism, in the idea of historical and artistic knowledge. She, of course, berates a student for his alignment with his own identity. He's a student of color. He says, I can't understand classical Bach, I think it is. And she kind of claims, and it's a very kind of sensible point, that we can all come to this work because it's the work, right? And of course, she has an interest in that, personally, because she herself transcends her own class origins, and that's part of the tragedy of the film, right? It's about understanding how desperate she is to reach this transcendence in the work. But the point stands, right? So there is a problem there about the inflexibility and the orthodoxy of a culture which says everybody in their lane, everybody in their place. You can only understand stuff that you have as your lived experience, right? As a white, male, cis art critic, how can I possibly write about the work of a black queer woman, right? But at the same time, the reverse applies. How can the art of a black queer woman have anything to do with the experience of a white cis male, right? So in that situation, we have a real problem because it's not so much that these identities are important, it's the fact that there's no fluidity or flexibility about the encounter that we have with each other. Very quickly, on another point about history and the crisis of authority, very quickly, there was a crisis of authority about the establishment 50 years ago. People like Marxist critics like John Berger railed against the modernist establishment. A whole bunch of critics around that time took on the Tate for its complete myopia about history, its kind of dogged essentialism when it came to modernism and all this kind of stuff. The weird thing is, though, 50 years later, if you go to the rehang of the Tate now, you are essentially reading an interpretation of art criticism, of art history, of British art history, which could have been taken out of John Berger. So the person who was the margin and the opponent of the establishment of the authority institution has essentially been absorbed into it. And the problem is not so much what is the narrative, but whether we have a situation where institutions impose their dogma on everybody else, and also threaten everybody who says, well, maybe actually we might like this for different reasons. You know, architecture, actually in the end, architects, is this a nice building for me? Do I get something from it as a user, right? I don't know if architects even think about the user anymore, but that's not my specialism, so.
Right, thank you very much. I'm going to come out to the audience if there's any questions, but I asked ChatGPT to write a review, just a 2-sentence review of Great Expectations. Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, that's a good start, is a sprawling narrative filled with memorable characters and intricate plot twists that capture the essence of Victorian society. However, the extensive length and occasionally meandering storyline may test the patience of some readers. I'll give you one more. The Bible. The Bible is a religious text revered by many, but its fragmented structure, inconsistent narratives, and controversial content make it a challenging and problematic work to approach critically. Its reliance on divine authority and lack of historical evidence undermine its credibility as a reliable source of knowledge and moral guidance. So you can see the worth of these guys already. Right.